Every vulnerability is a failure of assumptions. The opening, what you thought you knew. There is a particular kind of silence that falls in an incident war room when someone says the words that every responder dreads more than any specific technical finding. Not the firewall was bypassed, or the endpoint was compromised, or even the data was exfiltrated. The phrase that hollows out the room is this one: "We assumed that was covered." That sentence is the sound of a vulnerability revealing itself, not as a technical flaw in code, but as a gap between what the organization believed was true and what was actually true. The belief that the patch had been applied, the belief that the backup was restorable, the belief that the vendor had configured their integration securely, the belief that the detection rule was still firing. Each one of those beliefs left untested is an assumption. And in security, an assumption is a vulnerability with a fuse attached. Mental Model 27 states this directly. Every vulnerability is a failure of assumptions. What this means, at its deepest level, is that vulnerabilities do not primarily arise from the absence of security tools or the failure of security technology. They arise from the moment a security team stops asking, "How do I know this is true?" and starts operating on the quieter, more comfortable logic of, "We've always done it this way and nothing has gone wrong so far." The gap between what is assumed and what is verified is where attackers live. This session is about understanding that gap, how it forms, how it widens over time, what it looks like when it is finally exposed, and most importantly, how to develop the operational habit of hunting assumptions before they hunt you. We will work through the theory, the architecture, the tooling, the implementation decisions, and the failure scenarios. We will look at how this principle reshapes the way a security architect approaches threat modeling, how it changes the way a detection engineer thinks about rule coverage, and how a threat intelligence analyst learns not to treat their sources as infallible. And we will finish with a scenario that illustrates what happens when an organization confuses a vendor's marketing promise with a tested reality. The question this session asks you to carry throughout is deceptively simple. How do you know? The foundation, the anatomy of an assumption. To understand why assumptions are so dangerous in security, you first have to understand how they form. They do not form through negligence in most cases. They form through a process that looks at every step entirely reasonable. A team deploys a patch. The patching tool reports success. No one tests whether the target service actually restarted, whether the binary on disk is the new version, whether the package was applied to the correct directory, or whether a dependency conflict silently rolled the installation back. The team moves on. The assumption that the system is patched is now operational. It will inform risk decisions, shape audit reports, and provide false comfort to anyone who asks whether that particular vulnerability is addressed. Months later, a penetration tester exploits that exact vulnerability. The reporting console says patched, the host says otherwise. That scenario is not exotic. It happens with enough regularity that it has its own name in the field: patch drift, or more specifically, the gap between patch reporting and patch reality. The point is that the assumption was not born from carelessness. It was born from a reasonable inference. The tool said it worked, therefore it worked. That was never validated against evidence. Assumptions cluster in a few predictable places in security programs. They cluster around controls that are assumed to be working because they were working last time someone checked. They cluster around vendors and third parties who are assumed to meet security requirements because they signed a questionnaire or hold a certification. They cluster around detection coverage, where rules written to catch a specific technique are assumed to still be firing correctly against a production log pipeline that has been modified 3 times since the rule was written. They cluster around disaster recovery, where backup jobs complete successfully, and everyone assumes that means the data is restorable. until a ransomware event proves that backup completed and backup restorable are two different facts. The concept of due care and due diligence illuminates this directly. Due care is the obligation to act responsibly, to take security seriously, to invest in controls, to follow established practices. Due diligence is the obligation to verify, to provide evidence that due care has actually been exercised and is producing the intended outcomes. Organizations that practice due care without due diligence are building elaborate security programs on a foundation of assumption. They have controls. They have not proven those controls work. The distinction matters enormously in the aftermath of a breach, when regulators, auditors, and counsel all ask the same question: what did you do to verify that your controls were functioning? Understanding what a security control assessment actually involves is essential here. A control assessment is not a review of the paperwork describing a control. It is a systematic evaluation of whether a control is implemented correctly, whether it is operating as designed, and whether it is actually producing the outcome it was supposed to produce. An organization might have a policy requiring multi-factor authentication for all remote access. A control assessment goes beyond confirming the policy exists. It verifies that MFA is enforced in the technical configuration, that there are no bypass paths in the authentication logic, that the factor types in use are resistant to the attack patterns most relevant to the organization's threat profile, and that the logs confirm enforcement is happening in practice. The policy is the assumption. The assessment is the evidence. The relationship between a threat model and a risk assessment clarifies why assumption hunting must happen at the design stage, not just the testing stage. A threat model is the structured activity of asking, what could go wrong? Systematically enumerating threats, attack paths, and trust boundaries before a system is built or during its evolution. A risk assessment takes those threats and evaluates their likelihood and impact to inform prioritization. The threat model is where assumptions should be surfaced and challenged. Every trust relationship drawn in a system diagram is an assumption. Every boundary assumed to be impermeable is an assumption. The STRIDE methodology, which prompts designers to consider spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege, is, at its core, an assumption-challenging exercise. It asks, what did the designers assume to be true, and what happens when each of those assumptions is false? The structural tension, evidence versus comfort. The tension at the heart of this mental model is between the organizational pressure toward comfort and the security imperative toward evidence. Security assumptions are not simply technical errors. They are, in many cases, rational responses to real organizational constraints. Testing every assumption costs time, budget, and engineering capacity. Running a full restore test on your backup infrastructure requires taking a system offline, or standing up a parallel environment, or at minimum requiring storage engineers to spend hours verifying that a production dataset can be recovered within the organization's recovery time objective. Running a penetration test requires scoping, contracting, preparation, and the operational disruption that comes from having skilled testers actively probing your infrastructure. Running breach and attack simulation tools requires deployment, configuration, integration with detection pipelines, and ongoing tuning. None of this is free. The result is that organizations make implicit trades. They test some assumptions some of the time and infer the rest. The backup system that was tested 8 months ago is assumed to still be functioning correctly. The EDR configuration that was validated against a specific threat profile is assumed to still catch what it caught then. The vendor who passed a security assessment 18 months ago is assumed to have maintained that security posture since. These inferences are not irrational. They are the only way to operate a security program at human scale. but they are also the source of every "we assumed" that was covered moment in an incident war room. The structural question is not whether to make assumptions, that is unavoidable, but rather which assumptions carry the most risk if wrong, and what is the minimum verification cadence that makes those assumptions defensible rather than dangerous. This is where the mental model becomes operational. The security professional who deeply understands this principle does not try to eliminate all assumptions. They build a systematic practice of surfacing, prioritizing, and testing the most consequential ones. The distinction matters in another direction too. Not every untested assumption is the result of oversight. Some are the result of deliberate risk acceptance, a documented decision that the cost of verifying a particular assumption does not justify the effort given the current risk level. The danger is when deliberate risk acceptance shades invisibly into oversight, when the decision made 2 years ago by someone who has since left the organization is being treated as current by teams who do not know its context. Assumptions age. What was a reasonable untested belief in one threat environment may be an operational blind spot in another. Part of managing this model is building a review cadence, explicitly scheduling the moment when yesterday's risk acceptance is examined against today's threat landscape. Architectural philosophy, building systems that challenge their own assumptions. The most resilient security architectures are those designed with explicit mechanisms for assumption invalidation built in. This is not just a validation principle, it is an architectural one. How you design a system determines how easy or hard it is to know when your assumptions about that system are no longer true. Consider the principle of failing securely. A system designed to fail securely is one where, when a control fails or a configuration drift occurs, the default behavior is restrictive rather than permissive. If an authentication system cannot reach the MFA provider, a fail-open system allows access without MFA. A fail-secure system denies access. The fail-secure design is harder to operate. Users get locked out in unexpected circumstances. Help desk calls spike. Engineers get paged. But it also means that the assumption MFA is enforced cannot be silently invalidated by a provider outage. The failure is visible and loud rather than silent and invisible. Continuous security monitoring is the architectural response to the assumption problem at the operational level. Point-in-time assessments, the annual penetration test, the quarterly vulnerability scan are valuable, but they are snapshots. They answer the question of what was true at the moment of the test. A continuous monitoring program is designed to answer the question of what is true right now and to alert when the answer changes. The difference is the difference between a photograph and a live feed. File integrity monitoring is a concrete instantiation of this. You establish a cryptographic baseline of what every critical configuration file and system binary should contain. You monitor continuously for deviation. When a file changes in a way that was not part of an approved change, the assumption that the system is in its known good state is immediately invalidated, and an alert fires. Implementing a secure development lifecycle is how this principle enters the software engineering process. The assumption that developers will naturally write secure code is not evidence. The evidence comes from static analysis tools catching insecure patterns before they reach production, from software composition analysis, verifying that no third-party dependency carries a known critical vulnerability, from container image scanning, confirming that nothing vulnerable was bundled into the runtime image. Each of these tools is an assumption killer embedded into the pipeline. The developer's assumption that their code is secure is tested before it matters. There is a parallel architectural consideration when a zero-trust rollout breaks internal applications. The failure mode is well understood. The team assumed they knew all network flows, all the machine-to-machine communication, all the service accounts making lateral calls, all the legacy trust relationships that had accumulated over years of organic infrastructure growth. They did not. The correct architectural response is to run zero trust in monitoring mode before enforcement mode. In monitoring mode, every access request is logged, evaluated, and flagged if it would be denied under the future policy, but not yet actually denied. This phase builds the map of reality rather than the map of assumption. When enforcement begins, the policies are calibrated against actual traffic, not assumed traffic. The investment in the monitoring phase is precisely the investment in challenging the assumption that the organization understood its own communication patterns. Tools as assumption killers. Every tool in the security arsenal can be understood through the lens of which assumption it tests and what evidence it returns. This framing changes how you evaluate tools, how you deploy them, and how you interpret their output. Penetration testing is the most direct form of assumption killing available to a security team. It takes the assumption that is most comforting. Our perimeter is strong, our applications are hardened, our controls would stop an attacker, and assigns a skilled professional to disprove it. The output is not just a list of findings. It is evidence about which assumptions held and which did not, produced by someone operating with the adversarial creativity that internal teams, whose assumptions are embedded in their thinking, often cannot replicate about their own environment. What penetration testing costs and what it cannot do are both worth naming. The cost is significant: scoping, contracting, preparation, internal engineering time to support the engagement, and the post-test remediation work. The limitation is equally significant. A penetration test is a point-in-time exercise. The assumptions it validates or invalidates were true on the day of the test. 1 month after the test, new infrastructure was deployed. New code was pushed. New configurations drifted. The test told you that your assumptions were right in April. It cannot tell you whether they are still right in November. This is the argument for continuous validation, not a replacement of periodic testing. Backup restoration testing is perhaps the most underinvested assumption-killing practice in security programs, and almost certainly the one with the most catastrophic failure mode when skipped. The assumption at stake is that when something goes wrong, ransomware, deletion, corruption, hardware failure, the backup will restore cleanly, completely, and within the time the business requires. The evidence that tests this assumption is not a backup completion log. It is an actual restoration exercise. Take the backup, restore it to a test environment, verify the data is complete and consistent, measure the time it took, and confirm it falls within the organization's recovery time objective. Organizations that have never run this test have no evidence that their disaster recovery posture is what they believe it is. They have a comfort story that has never been questioned. Breach and attack simulation platforms address the assumption that detection controls are still active and still effective. EDR configurations drift. Detection rules are written against specific log formats, and those formats change when the logging pipeline is updated. SIEM correlation rules that were valid when an adversary technique was first documented may not fire correctly against a newer variant of the same technique. BAS tools address this by continuously running simulated attack behaviors, safe, controlled, instrumented, and checking whether the detection stack responds as expected. The output is not just the EDR blocked it. It is a continuous confirmation that the assumption of detection fidelity has evidence behind it today, not just 6 months ago. Vulnerability scanners address the assumption that patches have been applied as reported. The patch management system says compliant. The scanner says otherwise. The gap between these two is almost always meaningful and sometimes alarming. Scanners do not just catch missing patches. They catch misconfigured services, default credentials, exposed management interfaces, and deprecated protocol configurations, all of which represent assumptions that the security team may have never explicitly thought to question, precisely because they are not on any checklist. What the scanner costs is well understood. Licensing, scan windows, the operational overhead of triaging findings, the engineering time to remediate. What it cannot do is interpret context. A scanner finding that a system is running an old version of a library needs to be evaluated against whether that library is actually reachable, whether the vulnerable code path is exercised, and whether there are compensating controls in place. The scanner surfaces the assumption. The analyst determines whether it matters. Implementation depth. What building this actually involves. Building a continuous security monitoring program that genuinely kills assumptions rather than generating the appearance of validation is a specific kind of engineering challenge. It requires decisions about what to monitor, how to interpret change, and how to act on findings in a way that is sustainable rather than overwhelming. The starting point is log source selection, and this is where assumptions begin before the program even runs. An organization that assumes all relevant security events are captured in their SIEM may never discover that a critical segment of the network is not forwarding logs, that a cloud workload is generating events that no integration was configured to collect, or that a specific application error class is being suppressed by a log filter that was applied for storage cost reasons 2 years ago. Before tuning correlation rules, before building dashboards, before training analysts, you must establish evidence that the inputs to your monitoring program are complete. That requires a log source inventory, compared against your actual asset inventory, with every gap treated as an assumption that needs to be either resolved or formally accepted. For Windows and Linux servers, the implementation of centralized logging involves specific choices that carry specific risks. Windows event forwarding can be configured to push events from Windows hosts to a Windows event collector, which then forwards to a syslog-compatible pipeline. The assumption that this chain is operating correctly on every host must be tested. A host that stopped forwarding logs because of a group policy conflict is invisible to the monitoring program, and if no one checks whether the expected number of hosts are represented in the log stream, that gap may never surface. On Linux, syslog-ng or rsyslog configurations must be validated against actual event generation. It is not enough to confirm that the daemon is running. The test is whether a specific event type on a specific host actually appears in the central collector within an acceptable time window. Implementing file integrity monitoring on a sensitive directory involves establishing a baseline, defining an alert threshold, and building an investigation process for when alerts fire. Each of these steps has an assumption buried in it. The baseline assumes the system was in a known good state when the baseline was taken. If the system was already compromised before FIM was deployed, the baseline enshrines the compromise. The alert threshold has an assumption about what rate of change is suspicious versus routine. Too low and analysts are overwhelmed with false positives from legitimate deployments. Too high and meaningful changes slip through. The investigation process assumes that whoever responds to a FIM alert has the context to distinguish a legitimate deployment from an attacker's modification, which requires that change management records are integrated into the investigation workflow so that each change can be compared against an approved change ticket. Troubleshooting through the assumption lens. The most instructive way to understand this model is to watch it fail in real situations and trace the failure back to the specific assumption that broke. 3 scenarios are worth working through in detail. The first scenario is a red team exercise that compromises a domain controller in 2 hours while the blue team generates no alerts. This scenario has become almost formulaic in security exercises, but each iteration reveals the same underlying structure. The blue team assumed their detection coverage was sufficient. After the exercise, the question is not simply, what did the red team do that we didn't catch? It is, why did we believe our coverage was adequate in the first place? The diagnostic process starts with the SIEM. You examine which log sources are feeding the correlation rules that should have fired. For domain controller activity, you expect Windows security event logs, particularly event IDs related to directory service access, Kerberos ticket activity, and privileged group membership changes. If those event IDs are present in the SIEM, the next question is whether the correlation rules that consume them are correctly written and actively tuned. Rules written 18 months ago may reference field names from a log format that was updated since deployment. The rule may be syntactically valid, but semantically wrong. It runs without error, but never matches because the field it is checking no longer carries the value the rule expects. If the log sources are present and the rules appear correct, the next question is whether the rules were tested after the last pipeline migration. This is the assumption that most often goes unexamined, that the detection engineering work done before a logging infrastructure change remained valid after it. A rule validated against the old pipeline is an assumption about the new one. Remediating this requires a systematic revalidation process. Every rule should have a test case, and test cases should be run against the production pipeline after any infrastructure change. The second scenario involves a vulnerability that the patch management system reports as remediated, but a penetration test exploits successfully. The patch was applied. The console says so. The auditor reviewed the compliance report and flagged the host as patched. The penetration tester disagreed with all of them. The diagnostic starts with the host itself. You verify the actual binary version of the affected package by running it directly on the system, not by querying the patch management database. You check whether the service was restarted after the patch was applied. Some patches require a service or system restart to take effect, and if neither happened, the vulnerability persists at runtime even though the file on disk was replaced. You check whether the patching mechanism had any error in its logs for that host. Silent failures in patch deployment are more common than the console's success indicators suggest. If the binary is correct and the service was restarted, the next question is scope. Was the patch applied to all instances of this service? Organizations running containerized workloads, auto-scaling fleets, or golden image builds face a specific version of this problem. The patch was applied to the current running instances, but the image that spawns new instances was not updated. New hosts come online already vulnerable. The fix involves not just patching existing hosts, but updating the base image and validating that the deployment pipeline uses it. The third scenario involves a vendor who does not meet security requirements, discovered during an incident rather than a vendor assessment. This is the assumption that is perhaps most emotionally charged. The assumption that a trusted partner has maintained the security posture they represented when the relationship began. A vendor with a current ISO 27001 certification or SOC 2 type II report is not necessarily secure. Certifications are snapshots. They verify that a security program was in place and functioning at the time of the assessment. They say nothing about what happened after the auditors left. The root cause in vendor assumption failures is usually a lack of continuous monitoring of the vendor relationship. An initial security assessment was done during procurement. A questionnaire was completed. Certificates were exchanged. And then the relationship continued for years on the momentum of initial due diligence that was never refreshed. The remediation requires both the immediate tactical response, understanding what data or access the vendor had, containing the exposure, and the long-term programmatic response. Building a vendor risk management cadence that revisits key vendors on a schedule appropriate to their risk tier, rather than treating the onboarding assessment as a permanent credential. The role perspectives, 3 windows on the same failure. The principle of challenging assumptions looks different depending on where you sit in a security organization. 3 roles encounter it at distinctly different layers of the problem. The security architect encounters it during threat modeling, and specifically during the moment when they are reviewing a system design and have to ask, what does this diagram assume that might not be true? A system diagram is, at its core, a map of assumptions. Every arrow representing a trust relationship assumes that the trust is warranted. Every boundary line assumes that the boundary is enforced. Every authentication step assumes that the credentials being used are not compromised. During a zero-trust rollout, the architect is confronted with the architectural consequence of years of accumulated assumptions. The network communications that no one mapped, the service accounts that no one documented, the machine identities that authenticate to everything and were never inventoried. The specific moment where this mental model becomes urgent for the architect is when the first enforcement policy goes live and applications start failing. The diagnostic path is to treat each failure as a data point about an assumption. This application was not in the policy because no one assumed it needed to be. This service account was not enrolled in the identity provider because no one assumed non-human identities needed to be managed. Each failure rewrites the map. The detection engineer encounters this principle at the fidelity layer. They write a detection rule based on a specific attacker technique. Base 64 encoded commands in PowerShell, a specific HASSH fingerprint associated with a known SSH brute force tool, a command sequence that maps to a particular tactic. The rule is correct. It works in the test environment. It is deployed to production. And then one of several things happens. The log format changes, and the rule's field references become stale. The attacker modifies their tooling, and the specific string the rule depended on no longer appears. The pipeline that feeds the SIEM is migrated, and the normalization layer introduces a subtle transformation that breaks the rule's logic. The engineer assumed the rule would continue to work because the underlying technique remained relevant. What they did not account for is that the rule's validity depends on every link in a chain, log source, pipeline, normalization, field mapping, query syntax, and any link can change independently of the others. The engineer's practice shifts when this model is internalized. Rules are no longer written and deployed. They are written, deployed, and continuously validated with test cases that run against the production pipeline on a schedule and alert when they fail to produce the expected output. The threat intelligence analyst encounters this model when a finished intelligence product states that a campaign is active, and the intelligence turns out to describe a benign security scanner. The assumption being challenged here is that the intelligence source is accurate, that the enrichment pipeline is correctly distinguishing malicious and legitimate traffic, and that the behavioral indicators being used to characterize the campaign are actually exclusive to malicious actors. When a campaign report states active, and the sessions turn out to belong to a known research scanner, the analyst has to trace the failure through several layers. First, why did the sessions get attributed to the campaign? Was there an ASN overlap, a matching HASSH fingerprint, or a command pattern that appeared similar but was not identical? Second, what was the verification step that should have caught this before the report was published? The intelligence workflow should include a review gate where the attribution evidence is compared against a known benign scanner list before a campaign is characterized as active. The analyst who internalizes this model begins to treat every intelligence conclusion as a hypothesis that needs evidence, not a fact that needs a report. Case scenario: the cloud migration that nobody tested. A mid-market financial services company migrates its core customer data platform to a major cloud provider. The migration is led by an IT director who has worked with this provider before and holds the vendor in high regard. The platform hosts customer financial records, account histories, transaction data, statements for approximately 300,000 retail customers. The constraint is time. The migration has a hard deadline driven by the expiration of the on-premises data center lease. The security team is involved in the migration planning, but security testing is scheduled for after go-live, on the assumption that the cloud provider's infrastructure controls and the shared responsibility documentation provide adequate baseline assurance. Here is where the assumptions begin stacking. The IT director assumes the cloud provider is backing up all customer data automatically. This assumption is not unreasonable. The provider does offer backup services, but it is wrong in one specific and critical dimension. The backup service must be explicitly configured and enabled per resource. It is not on by default. No one on the migration team checked this configuration because no one thought to ask whether it needed to be configured. The provider's marketing language says durable and resilient storage, which is true of the underlying infrastructure. It is not a guarantee that the customer's data is backed up. The security team assumes the cloud configuration is following the organization's hardening standard. This assumption was never tested because the testing cadence, a cloud configuration posture scan, was scheduled to begin 3 months after migration, once the environment had settled. During those 3 months, the configuration was in the state the migration engineers left it. Several storage buckets with broadly permissive access policies intended to facilitate migration, which were never tightened post-migration. The application team assumes that their database credentials are stored securely in the application configuration. They are not. They are stored in plaintext environment variables in the container definition, which any engineer with IAM access to the container service can read. 6 weeks after go-live, a junior engineer attempting to debug a production issue discovers that a storage bucket containing customer statements is publicly accessible. The bucket was configured with a permissive policy during migration and never locked down. The exposure window is 6 weeks. The scope of customer data visible during that window includes account statements for approximately 40,000 customers. The incident response begins with the question that should have been asked before go-live. What can actually be seen from outside? The security team runs an external scan of the cloud environment, not from inside the account with administrative credentials, but from a neutral external perspective that mirrors what an attacker would see. The bucket is immediately visible. The response also reveals that the backup service was never configured. The only recovery path available is the snapshots taken by the migration engineer on the day of cutover, 6 weeks old. The remediation proceeds on 2 tracks simultaneously. The immediate track involves locking the bucket, rotating all credentials, and beginning a customer notification process in accordance with regulatory requirements. The longer track involves the post-incident reconstruction of how every assumption in the environment can be converted to a continuously verified fact. The cloud configuration posture scanner is deployed immediately, not in 3 months. It runs against the production environment and returns 47 findings, of which 11 are high severity. 7 of those 11 have compensating controls that make them lower actual risk than the raw score suggests, but 4 represent genuine exposures that should have been caught before go live. The backup configuration is enabled, and a restoration test is scheduled for the following week. The credentials are migrated from environment variables into a secrets manager with automated rotation. The trade-off being confronted throughout this remediation is the same trade-off that created the incident: the cost of testing assumptions before they matter versus the cost of discovering they were wrong after the fact. The pre-go-live security testing that was skipped in the interest of the deadline would have taken 2 weeks and would have caught the permissive bucket policy. 2 weeks of delay versus a regulatory notification process, customer notification costs, reputational damage, and the engineering time to remediate an environment that was never hardened in the first place. The calculation, made retrospectively, is not close. The IT director's sign-off on the remediation plan includes one clause that reflects the deepest lesson of the incident. The organization will not perform a future migration, cloud deployment, or major configuration change without a signed documentation of what has been assumed and what has been verified. Every assumption must either be converted to evidence through a test or documented as a risk acceptance with an owner, a time horizon, and a review date. The document is called an assumption register. It is not a security industry standard term. It is an honest acknowledgement that the gap between assumption and evidence is where incidents live, and that naming the gap is the first step toward closing it. The scenario ends well by the standards of incident response. No evidence of data exfiltration was found during the 6-week window, the notification was completed within regulatory timelines, and no regulatory penalty was issued. But the security team knows, and the IT director eventually comes to know, that the outcome was fortune as much as preparation. A different external party discovering that bucket, a threat actor rather than a junior engineer, would have produced a very different ending. Closing, the practice of not knowing. There is a phrase that circulates among experienced security professionals that sounds, when you first encounter it, almost defeatist. The phrase is this: the most dangerous words in security are "I know." The more accurate framing is not that knowledge is dangerous. It is that the certainty that comes with assumed knowledge, the closure of inquiry that happens when you stop asking, "How do I know this is still true?" is what actually puts organizations at risk. Not ignorance, misplaced confidence in knowledge that has never been tested. Security architecture that internalizes this model does not stop verifying when a control is deployed. It builds verification into the control's existence. Backup systems that are never restoration tested are not backup systems. They are backup rituals. Detection rules that are never tested against the production pipeline after a migration are not detection rules. They are documentation of past capability. Vendor certifications that are reviewed at onboarding and never revisited are not assurance. They are paperwork. The discipline this model asks you to develop is the habit of converting your most important beliefs into questions, not as an act of doubt, but as an act of professional responsibility. I believe MFA is enforced becomes I have evidence, tested this quarter, that MFA cannot be bypassed on this path. I believe the patch was applied becomes I have scanner output, run after the change window, confirming that this host is no longer vulnerable. I believe the vendor is secure becomes I have a current assessment, scoped to their relevant control domains, signed by an accountable owner. None of this is achievable all at once. The scope of what can be verified is always smaller than the scope of what exists. This is where the risk treatment framework returns. Some assumptions will be verified continuously, some periodically, some will be formally accepted with documentation, and some will persist as unknown unknowns. The difference between a mature security program and an immature one is not that the mature program has no unverified assumptions. It is that the mature program knows which ones it is carrying, has made a deliberate decision about each of them, and revisits those decisions when the threat landscape changes. Every vulnerability at its root is the residue of something someone once assumed to be true and never checked again. The practice of security is, in large part, the practice of asking, how do we know? Not once, but continuously, of the controls and systems and vendors and configurations and people that the organization has decided to trust. Ask it before the penetration tester does. Ask it before the ransomware does. Ask it as a discipline, not as a reaction. Because the gap between assumption and evidence does not sit still. It grows, and it grows toward the attacker. End of session, mental model. Every vulnerability is a failure of assumptions.